welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 10 of an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys, today I want to deal with Stresa, the Stresa Conference, and really the lead up to a bunch of these pacts that preceded the start of World War II that ultimately failed in one capacity or another. And so Stresa is preceded by the Four Powers Pact. It's preceded by the Locarno Pact in 1925, and it's trying to create a measure of peace and stability against German aggression at that period in history. Now, the Locarno Pact is interesting because what the Locarno Pact did was it protected the Western Front of the German side of what would become the war, the Western Front, and mainly had to do with a lot of France's insecurities about Germany and Germany rearming. And in some respects, you could understand why, because that border there between the French and Germans, that was really at the heart of World War I in many respects. France, I believe, if I remember correct, in World War I lost something like, 40% of all its men between the ages of like 18 and 35. I read that quite a while back. But the point being is that there was a lot of men lost. France had a great fear and insecurity about Germany and what it felt was German aggression. So the Locarno Pact was one that was designed to protect that Western frontier by demilitarizing that area there and ultimately protecting the French, the Belgium, and I believe the Dutch as well too. Italy and Britain were supposed to be the guarantors of that. What the Locarno Pact did not do is address the Eastern Front eventually, right, with Eastern Europe and how the Germans were going to deal over there, because in a parliamentary system that Germany had after the Kaiser had fallen, there's large claims of land that the Versailles Treaty carved up and took away from Germany that Germany never would have agreed to. Places like Danzig and the Polish corridor, which were German territories before World War I and before Versailles, a few other territories in there that included lands in Poland, Czechoslovakia, which was a new country carved out of Germany in part, and I believe as well Lithuania. And so nobody dealt with the Eastern Front. That's why some people argue that if the British never made a solemn oath to defend a certain section of Poland, that Hitler only probably would have went east and not west. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. It's a theory, but it outlines what's going on in the diplomacy part leading up to World War I. And so we fast forward now to Austria, which again is one of those territories that the Germans wanted, that Hitler wanted. In 33, I believe it is 33, Engelbert Dollfuss is elected prime minister or chancellor there. Dollfuss is a devout Catholic, and he's dealing with a bunch of radical socialists, Marxists, Bolsheviks invading Austria, very similar to what was happening in Italy in the teens and the 1920s. There's also a large Nazi party contingency in Austria at the time as well, too. So Dollfuss brings down the hammer on the socialists. He suppresses political parties. he becomes sort of a fascist leader himself, or should I say, an authoritarian leader. Again, the word fascism is it's a little too widely used. Okay, as I said before, fascism only truly exists in Italy as an ideology. It's an Italian conception. So again, he becomes an authoritarian leader who allies himself very closely with Mussolini, and Mussolini vows to protect Austria, especially from German aggression. Dollfuss meets with Mussolini. Eventually, they schedule another meeting, and the Nazi Party in Germany assassinates Dollfuss, which creates a crisis immediately. As I said to you before, in response, Mussolini was outraged, and nobody was more anti-Germany than Mussolini in 1935. Nobody. He was by far the biggest anti-German, anti-Hitler at that time, because Dollfuss was a friend of Mussolini's. And on the news that Dollfuss was assassinated by the Nazi Party, he was enraged, essentially calling Hitler a madman. So, as Mussolini is sending 4 battalions to the Brenner Pass after the assassination of Dollfuss, Mussolini calls to the French and to the British, saying, listen, I can't hold this guy by myself. I can't do it. If we're going to protect Austrian independence and stop this German aggression, I need you now. But of course, the French and the British didn't want to get in a war. Not at that time, at least. Again, it was going through appeasement movements following sort of this post-traumatic World War I mentality that was sweeping both nations. But it was Mussolini at that point that was calling the world to stop Hitler at the time. Now, as the Austrian incident settles down, Italy protects Austria from an invasion. At that point, Hitler is forced to disavow the events at Austria. He has to remove a bunch of ambassadors in order to disavow himself, to show face to the world. It's an embarrassing moment. Behind the scenes, they say Hitler was enraged that the Nazi Party in Austria had assassinated Dollfuss. It was just a bad political move, bad optics, and Hitler is scrambling now to save face via public relations. The after effect of the Dollfuss assassination is the Stresa Conference in Stresa, Italy, where Italy, Britain, and the French come together to create the Stresa Front. But as Patrick Buchanan says in his book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, there was a worm in the apple, and the worm in the apple was the British. While the French and the Italians especially were ready to create a strong united front against Hitler, the British were double dealing behind the scenes without anybody knowing, as they were negotiating a private pact with the Germans to give the Germans more territorial gains at sea and in the air. This ultimately undermined the Stresa Pact. The Stresa Pact was probably the final moment that Germany could have been stopped prior to World War II, because 36, 37, 38, Hitler's building up his army. There's maybe a chance at Munich that happens a couple years later, but clearly Hitler is building his military force. The French, like the Italians, are in a very similar situation, not like the British, because the British are an island. They're separated. At the very least, they got a body of water that kind of protects them. But the French were right on the border of Germany, and Italy is adjacent to Austria, which Germany wants. The moment Germany goes in to take Austria, all you got now is a little bit of Switzerland, and now the Italians and the Germans are neighbors all of a sudden. This all plays into the mindset of Mussolini as we get closer to World War II, as he's completely isolated and abandoned by the French and by the British. And this is why through 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, Mussolini is calling for help here from the British and the French and anybody else who would step in. There's going to come a point in time where Mussolini has to make a decision. And we see this later on. Who does he side with? By the time we get to 1940, I believe, is when Hitler invades France. By that point, Germany had gone through all of Western Europe. He had conquered everybody but Italy. And at that point, if you're Mussolini, what are your options? Either you join him or you get ran over from him, knowing that nobody's coming to your help. You can say, well, that was weak. Yeah, but maybe he wasn't willing to risk Italy. Not at that moment, not until somebody reacted. That is the fact that he also knew fighting in Spain, helping Franco, and now in Ethiopia, he needed time to rebuild his military. He needed time. And that's, as I talked about in the last cast, leading up to the Pact of Steel, that's what Mussolini's doing. He's buying time to build his military. He's not looking as the Pact of Steel as a necessary military alliance. He looked at it as, I got to buy time here. That's why the agreement in the Pact of Steel was 3 to 4 years. I got to move my factories. I got to rearm my country. I need more advanced weaponry. And in the end, Hitler's rash actions puts Italy in a bad position. You could say that it was bad foresight by Mussolini by signing this pact, that he was warned from the inside, but there wasn't a whole lot of options. Franco stayed out of the war. Mussolini, his options were much more limited. I think he probably could have stayed out. I think there was, at that point, some anger at the British, anger at the French, for reacting so late and putting him in that position. And at that point, he did want to be at the negotiating table on behalf of Italy. If the Germans, who at the time looked like were going to win, won that war. Some cases, it makes sense. Now, was there a little bit of greed by Mussolini at that point? You come so far attempting to create this force to stop Germany? Possibly. But your mindset is always shifted at that point when you know that nobody's coming. And Stresa was the last chance. And the British blew it. They absolutely blew it by double dealing on the back end. And as historians have noted, and Buchanan actually cites the sources here, I'll get them to you in the description. But up until 1935, after the assassination of his friend Dollfuss, nobody was more anti-Hitler than Mussolini was. And because Hitler had invited Mussolini in, Hitler showed Mussolini the factories, the military buildup. I've talked about this before. When Mussolini and his son-in-law Ciano saw the military buildup of the Germans, I believe as early as 34, their instant reaction was, holy crap, this guy's going to walk through Europe. This guy's getting ready to start another world war. They knew exactly what they were facing, sitting almost adjacent as neighbors with Germany. What do you got in between them? Switzerland? And then a weak Austria that Italy has vowed to protect. You got to ask yourself how these geopolitical situations happen. They're not as black and white as we like to make them in the West, and they're definitely not as black and white as all the propaganda we saw that came from the communists after the war. So it's quite amazing to read this history. Let me read here from Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. as I close out this little short cast here. Quote, when Fladden, who was the leader of France, declared at Stresa that if Hitler committed one more violation of Versailles, France would mobilize. Mussolini called for even stronger joint action. MacDonald and Simon refused to make any commitment. Concludes historian J. Kenneth Brodie. What had the Stresa Conference rough? The vigorous leadership of Mussolini and the firm determination of France to arrive at concrete courses of action to face up to the German threat, contrasted to the British horror of any commitment and Britain's yearning for some kind of arrangement with Germany. The clarity, the logic, the pertinacity, and the force of the Franco-Italian position had been met by British vacillation, hesitancies, and obfuscations. End quote. So there you go. Even after the assassination of the Chancellor of Austria, everybody knows what's about to happen. The world is about to go to war again. An attempt to stop Hitler fails because the same pattern happens over and over and over throughout this process. It is the British making one disastrous foreign policy decision after another. The French aren't much help, but in this case, I think the French knew they had a lot to lose. They did not want a German mobilizing on their border. That's why Locarno was so big to them, right? To protect that, area that if effectively unites Germany and France. And what will we see later on? We will see, of course, the French create that big Maginot Line, and the Germans later on walk right through there in less than 2 weeks. This was all leading up to a world war. The question is, what side of the aisle would each player fall on? It was not as black and white as we like to make it in the West, because that's what we usually do. We play a political propaganda campaign in the West of we're the good guys, everybody else is the devil kind of a thing. We were doing that back then. We're doing that now as well too. We don't take nuance into account, and it really makes for a great disservice of history. Mussolini was ready to stop Hitler. He saw him as the greatest threat in Germany. He warned the entire world, and yet he was left out to dry by the Allies, who quite frankly were pretty cowardly at the time. So there you have it. This is part 10, Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. I want to thank you for joining me again tonight. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.